All right. I sure hope this is recording. Mercury retrograde. Again, my name is Katie Sweetman, and I'm with Empowering Astrology. And my latest webinar is on Pluto. And why did I decide to do a webinar about Pluto today? Because right now, as we speak, the Sun and Pluto are having what's called an opposition. Looks like there's a question. Yes, thank you. It is recorded. So Pluto and the Sun are having an opposition right now. And it's a moment when the energy of Pluto is very present. It's very saturated in our experiences and our thoughts, even if we don't even realize it. And we'll go into more about what that means, this idea of Pluto as an invisible force in our lives and how we need to kind of change our awareness so that we can see things a little differently. So I named this, turning shadows into light, because Pluto really does help us to connect to this idea of consciousness and to work through our shadow, and we'll learn what the shadow is. We'll learn what the shadow is while, looks like, wait, if you're using the annotation, I don't know what's going on. Looks like it's drawing on the PowerPoint presentation, but good times, Mercury retrograde. So this idea that we have something called the shadow, and that it's something that we all need to work on, this part of ourselves that is a little bit disconnected from our consciousness. We project it onto other people, and it's an area where we have our own darkness, and we'll learn what that entails. So as we record this, it's July 13th, 2019, and the name of this webinar is Pluto, Turning Shadows into Light. Again, my name is Katie Sweetman. I'm here in New York City. I'm here in Brooklyn. I'm a consulting astrologer. I have clients around the world. I also get to share my astrology on both Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Please follow me on social media if you don't already. I have a newsletter, which you can sign up for on my website. And Empowering Astrology, I created it. It's kind of hard to believe that it's coming up on 9.5 years. So thank you all for being a part of my work and being part of my journey and future webinars and future ways of learning about astrology. Just a kind of a quick rundown of what we're going to go through today. This is more for those who need a sense of structure. So part one, Pluto in astronomy. And when you take some of my webinars, I do include a bit about astronomy, because it's really important to understand what it is in the sky that we are looking at and talking about. And for instance, how does a new moon work? What's the mechanics of that? It just makes us better astrologers, or better people that can understand how something like a new moon or a full moon, or even something like Pluto where is it in the sky and how it can have an effect on us. So this is a photo of Pluto. This photo was taken by the New Horizons probe that was sent out, and it arrived finally after, I believe it was 9 years. It arrived at Pluto in July of 2015. So at this point, as we have this webinar, it's been 4 years. And if you think about it, nobody had ever seen Pluto before. Pluto is so far out in our solar system that it's not visible with the naked eye. And I think it's important to see Pluto. I know we're talking about a planet, but this idea of what Pluto symbolizes in astrology, it's so rich. And it's up until 2015, we hadn't even seen it before. And now we've seen it. It cannot be unseen. So there's something about, on a collective level, we're seeing something now that we haven't seen before. Pluto is so far out. It's in this part of the solar system. When I say our solar system, this idea that we've got planets that are rotating around the sun. There's this, it's called the Kuiper belt. It's a sort of an area of objects that rotate around the sun, and that includes a lot of different what are called minor planets and different material. And it's located beyond Neptune, and I'll show a little picture of what that means. It's Kuiper Belt. It's just, I think it's important to place Pluto in our minds on where this is in the solar system. Because when we start to deal with what are called outer planets, you know, your Uranus, your Neptune, your Pluto, and even other planets that have been discovered recently, they were completely unknown to astrologers in ancient times. Up until 1780, when Uranus was discovered, the last known planet that we could see was Saturn. So Saturn represented this limit, this boundary between what we could see and what we could not see. Pluto is part of a class of planets called trans-Neptunians. This includes other planets like Eris, Haumea, if I'm saying that correctly, McKay. Yeah, if you're not a space nerd like I am, it might be completely new information that there's other planets in our solar system beyond the ones that maybe we learned in grade school or middle school science. Pluto is what's called a dwarf planet, and it's, you know, Pluto is smaller than our moon. And so this idea that something so small can still have such a powerful impact in astrology. And if we wanted to get to Pluto, it's 4.5 billion miles, which that's also 7.2 billion kilometers. It's very, very far. So I was saying that in 2015, we couldn't even see a photo of Pluto. Previous attempts to see Pluto included some of the following images. The first real photo of Pluto, and there was a photo that was taken in the early 1900s, how it was discovered, which I'll get to in a moment. But up until the Hubble telescope, which is this very large telescope that's put into space that helps us to study space, the photo on the left in 1994 was like the best image we had. 2 years later, that fuzzy gray blob was the best we could see of Pluto. So there's something that it's slowly coming into our consciousness and our awareness as time goes by. And then here we have an animated GIF. The fuzzy image, that's like the best we could have done, let's say in 2003. That's when that photo was taken. And then a little over 10 years later, 12 years later, we finally have the first clear image of Pluto. So something is slowly coming into focus, both on an astronomical level and an astrological level. I found this online. I thought it was super awesome. It's made by NASA. It's an animation of the flyby that the New Horizons probe did of Pluto. So the image, the thing that's going around Pluto actually has a moon. It's called Charon, or maybe I'm saying it wrong. It's named after the ferryman in the Greek mythology who would ferry souls back and forth. And yes, Pluto is named after the lord of the underworld in the Greek mythology and the Roman mythology. As planets are discovered in the solar system, they have to be named after gods or goddesses that are associated with creation myth. It's also really important to understand how far Pluto is and how long it takes to make one rotation around the sun, 248 years. And as you and I talk, Pluto will not return to the same point in the sky for another 248 years. That's obviously a long time. You and I will not be around. And so this idea that Pluto in astrology takes a long time to get back to where it is when we were born. Also, fun fact, people will not have Pluto returns because they won't live that long, but buildings, countries can have Pluto returns, and maybe my more astute listeners, watchers know that the United States is going through something called a Pluto return right now. Pluto is returning to where it was at the moment that the country was born in 1776. It's a completely separate conversation, but I just wanted to kind of plant that little seed. So Pluto has an irregular elliptical orbit, which in the next slide you'll see what that means. And it's again important to understand because Pluto will spend shorter periods of time in some signs and longer periods of time in other signs. So Pluto, slow-moving planet, all the way out there. It has such a wonky orbit that it crosses the orbit of Neptune, and it did so back from the 70s to the 90s. This is a little bit of a better animation. It's at an incline. That line in the middle is something called the ecliptic. The ecliptic is just simply what the path the planets take around the sun. It's a common path, and that's actually how we know what the zodiac is, because the zodiac is the constellations that run along the ecliptic from the perspective of Earth. As I was saying, from February 1979 until February of 1999, Pluto was closer to Earth than Neptune because its wonky orbit, it crossed the orbital path of Neptune, and Neptune was actually a farther planet out in our solar system than Pluto. Pluto was discovered in 1930 by an American astronomer named Clyde Tombaugh. Pluto had been discovered earlier. This is kind of a little bit of a technicality. One of the things that they do in astronomy is that when they're looking for planets, they go back to historical, what are they called, like plates of the sky, and I'm sure they do this by computer now, but this is how they would have done in 1930. They look at old plates, like photographic plates, to see if there's been a shift between an object. Now, stars, they pretty much don't move. That's another topic, but planets do. Planet actually is a Greek word that means wanderer. So they discovered Pluto from these plates that were taken by another astronomer, Percival Lowell. I think he's also American as well. And I think these plates were taken in like the early 1900s, but he had died before he could discover it. So this astronomer ended up finding that there was actually a planet out there. And this is what I mean by these plates. It's so faint, but they could tell that this one object in one plate had moved compared to, looks like 6 days later. The last planet to be discovered before Pluto was Neptune, and that was 1846. So there had been a long time between this discovery of a planet and then the discovery of Pluto. Pluto was discovered because there was this idea that there was a planet 9, quote unquote, out there. So different astronomers in different places around the world were looking for what was called, they thought was planet 9, and they thought Pluto would be this idea that's like the next planet after Neptune. But the more that they discovered about the solar system, they realized that Pluto didn't quite fit the same mold as, say, Neptune or Jupiter or Saturn. It was in a little bit of a different category and class. So there's kind of abandoned this idea of Planet 9, but that's how Pluto was found. Fast forward to 2006, this is where you'll hear people say, oh, I hear Pluto's not a planet anymore. Well, from an astronomical perspective, it got demoted to what's called a dwarf planet. It doesn't quite have the same characteristics, as like I said, as Mars, as Saturn, as Jupiter. This is all astronomical stuff, but on an astrological level, Pluto is still very much a planet. Astrologers didn't stop using Pluto in 2006 because astronomy decided it wasn't a planet anymore. In fact, astrologers, we know not to ignore Pluto because it's a very powerful planet in the chart, and it's a powerful influence, especially during what's called a transit. So Pluto in astrology, what's the difference? Now that we know what Pluto means in astronomy, we can place it in our solar system. We know what it is. What does it mean in astrology? So these are the two glyphs, the two symbols for Pluto. Um, they're the one on the right. I feel like you don't see it as much anymore, but I know the website astro.com, which has lots of free charts, still uses this glyph. The P with the looks like an L on the bottom. It's actually comes from the name of Percival Lowell, the guy that sort of initially found Pluto, although he died before that could be realized. But the one on the left is more common. That's just so that when you're looking at your own chart, depending on where you've gotten it from, what software has calculated it, you might see one of the other symbols. Pluto represents the shadow side of life. We will discover more what this is. And, I should also add that in this webinar, we might touch on really hard or emotional or difficult stuff. I mean, that's what we're getting into with Pluto. And I think it's important that to maybe just take a little bit of you might have your own experience with Pluto. Maybe you've been studying astrology and maybe you have a lot of like, oh, my Pluto this, my Pluto that. I think it's good just to kind of be a little bit more of an objective observer, because Pluto, and this is a short list of words, but they are not pleasant words, because what's the shadow? The shadow is the darker side of life, the darker side of ourself. It's words like shame, it's words like power, it's words like oppression, abuse, rage, jealousy, hatred, but also death and rebirth. And so we have to find within ourselves that these are things that lie within us that maybe we don't want to recognize, or maybe we don't want to admit are there. But it's an energy. It's an energy that's present in this world, and we have a connection to it. So Pluto helps us to kind of connect to this level of energy. Pluto can often show us something that we don't want to face, and we'll discuss about what that means, let's say like on transit. So when you have that at different points in your life, when Pluto aspects different planets or different houses, there's a process that happens. I think that there's something that's in our Pluto, in our chart, that can sometimes express these words, these energies, this consciousness that, what we saw in the previous slide. And as I said, there's darkness in this world. There's darkness in myself. There's darkness in you. That's just the nature of life. Everything is in polarity, but it's what we do with it, of course. And all this is about learning to have consciousness, learning to put light where there was darkness, to turn shadows into light. Again, we all have a dark side. It's in us. So hopefully through this webinar and maybe through your own personal work, that you realize that everything, is to have the choice to work on the things that are in our shadow, that are in our Pluto placement by sign, our Pluto placement by house, maybe even the aspects that it makes, that we can, when we put something in light, it means that we've put it into consciousness, we see it. Otherwise, Pluto is invisible. Otherwise, Pluto is something that exists, as I was saying in the astronomy part, something that's out of focus, something that we are aware of, but not quite aware of what it is. So otherwise, something lives in unconsciousness. It's something that's in the back of our head. It's something that comes out in dreams. And for, I use this word anti-consciousness. Like, what is anti-consciousness? Anti-consciousness is when you know that your actions are having an effect on somebody or doing something or not being a force of good, but you do it anyway. We all have those moments where we feel destructive, where we want to destroy, where we want to hate, or we feel jealousy. Sometimes we revel in it. I'm saying this as a Scorpio. It's natural as humans to do so, but we have to realize that we have a choice in how we live these energies and work these energies. Do we put light on them? Do we choose something very differently? Do we be in consciousness? Without a mirror, our blind spot will get us every time. And so Pluto is a way to see that blind spot. And I would also say that there's a holisticness to astrology. You could maybe say that other planets, when taken in the whole and looking at the chart, helps us to see our blind spots. I mean, I think that's one of the real powers of astrology. It gives language and helps us to see things that are otherwise there's no language for. It helps to connect the dots within. It helps us to give voice to feelings. And so for me, the way that I see Pluto, it's like a mirror. It helps us to see the things that otherwise would be in our unconscious. So I said this earlier, how can a tiny planet billions of miles away have such an impact? And astrology teaches us that everything, like the microcosm is the macrocosm, as above, so below. So even though we call it Pluto, even though it's a planet that's 4.5 billion miles away, it's an energy, it's an archetype, it's something in the matrix that we now have an ability to access. And I think that, and I'll discuss this a little bit further in the presentation, that I think in order to really, truly work with Pluto, we need to be at the level of the matrix. I mean, we have to sort of bring our awareness that there's something that's happening invisibly behind the scenes, and then there's something that we are living and experiencing. And so there's this idea of like a holographic universe, and Pluto is just a way of accessing certain energies within the matrix. Now, if this presentation was on Neptune, we'd be having a different conversation, but Neptune, Uranus, these outer planets, they help us to connect to something that had previously been unconscious. And I think that with Pluto, where we'll talk about, let's say, what was happening historically when Pluto was discovered and how that affected astrology or affected humanity. But Pluto is connecting us to an energy that's always been present. We just weren't ready to work on it. I think that every time a planet is discovered, which is interesting now within the last 15 years, there's been a lot of new planets discovered. But between 1930 and say 1990s, early 2000s, there wasn't any discoveries of planets other than Chiron in 1977. So I think we're in a time, personally, it's just my personal opinion, of rapid awakening and growth and expansion, and we have to have new tools in which to grow and transform, to look at our stuff, to choose, hopefully, to be better people, better human beings on this planet. But as we do so, we have to look at the stuff that's always been there. We just weren't able to see it because we didn't have the awareness to see it. So when a planet is discovered, it saturates the collective. So when I say the collective, I mean like humanity. I mean history, the experiences of that time with its archetype. We see this in the 1780s. Uranus is discovered. In astrology, it's a planet of revolutions and awakening, and we saw the 1780s as this very turbulent time. Fast forward into the 1840s, Neptune is discovered. That time was also a very spiritual time. It was this arrival of new religions, photography, this idea that you could capture an image and fix it in time. That was what was coming out in the 1840s, 1830s. So Pluto was discovered in the 1930s. But I'll back up for a second. So when something is previously undiscovered, whether it's Neptune, Uranus, Pluto. It's now something is in our awareness, and I made this point earlier. So, also said this earlier, everything beyond Saturn is invisible. So now with Pluto, we're seeing something that we haven't been able to see before. And so we are also, when Pluto was discovered in 1930, this might be the next slide, yes. When Pluto was discovered in the 1930s, I don't know how many of you know your history, but the 1930s was not a particularly good time for humanity. And Pluto, I think, opened us up to something that was, again, always there within the kind of the matrix of humanity. A darkness. It was the rise of fascism. We saw war. We saw unbelievable horrors. This is where we're talking about Pluto on a macro level. And I say this like not to, we need to witness this. Remember I said that we need to have a very almost detached view of Pluto right now, because we don't want to get sucked into the emotional side of this where it's like, oh, what's going to happen to me? Oh, what's Pluto going to do to me? But just be aware that there is this energy of transformation and evolution that's at play. But in order to do so, we have to look at the shadow side of life. And so humanity went through this great time of upheaval around the time that Pluto was discovered. Pluto's also the psyche, helps us to connect to the level of the psyche. And I think that was around the time that, you had Freud, you had Jung. I mean, I know that kind of stretched into the earlier 1900s, but psychology, that was a radical idea at the time. Now we take it for granted, this idea of the psyche, that there's something called the unconscious or the collective unconscious. These were completely foreign ideas at the beginning of the 20th century. Now it's really well integrated. So on an astrological side of things, we've had nearly 90 years to work with Pluto and put it in the chart. I remember when I was a teenager and I was reading books on astrology, this was kind of pre-internet, I'm dating myself, Pluto was still kind of a new reference in astrology books, I think even into the 60s and 70s. And so there was a time when I think astrologers didn't know what to do with it. And now it's, we wouldn't dare to say that it's on a planet anymore or take it out of the chart. That would be as if we're trying to not see something anymore. And so as I was saying, that Pluto helps us to connect to the level of the psyche, the level of the soul. And soul is kind of a big word, that there is something beyond ourselves that is growing, it's having many lifetimes, it's evolving, it's having different experiences, different choices. That's certainly the vantage point that I see astrology from. This kind of takes us into something called evolutionary astrology, which technically I don't do evolutionary astrology, but I just kind of want to put this on your radar in case you are studying different types of astrology, more of the modern psycho-spiritual side of astrology. There is a branch of evolutionary astrology that does use Pluto. I don't use it the same way, but I just kind of wanted to put that out there in case you are familiar with that branch of evolutionary astrology that focuses a lot on Pluto. Because of Pluto's long orbit, it can spend a decade or more in a sign. Pluto, because it has that wonky orbit and how it travels the ecliptic, it could just seem like it's going much faster through other signs and much slower through other signs. I think this is actually a little bit of a blessing. Pluto spends some of the least amount of time in Scorpio, which I think, maybe that's proof of something out there looking out for us, I hope. Astrology joke. But it spends about 9 years in Scorpio and Sagittarius, but it spends about 30 years in Taurus and Gemini. And don't worry, none of you are alive who's had Taurus and Pluto and Taurus or Pluto and Gemini. Pluto was in Taurus, I believe it was the early 1850s up until the early 1880s. And then Pluto was in Gemini, early 1880s, up until the start of World War One. And then Pluto goes into Cancer, and the whole world changes after World War One. So it's important to also understand it from an astrological perspective is that when Pluto goes through a sign, we are working through the shadow of that sign, the underside of that sign. So going through, say, Sagittarius, like it was 1995 to 2008, we were working through the underside of Sagittarius, the underside of faith, belief. We saw the rise of fanaticism. So there's the idea that there is this very collective experience in addition to a personal experience with Pluto. Right now, Pluto is in Capricorn. It's been in Capricorn since 2008. Again, it's also important to take consciousness that when Pluto goes into what's called a cardinal sign, Capricorn is a cardinal sign, Cancer is a cardinal sign. It like dipped back and forth between Gemini and Cancer, like 1912, 1913, 1914, and then it goes into Cancer, World War One. It goes into Capricorn, 2008, and we saw a lot of big shifts with the sign of Capricorn, what Capricorn governs over, which is governing. It's business, it's finance, it's power structures, it's literally structures. Capricorn is a sign of matter. And I think it's, in a way, it's important to realize that Pluto is showing us the karma of a sign. And right now we're dealing with the karma of Capricorn, the karma of institutions, the karma of power and control. And there's been a lot of things coming up in the last 10 years. But in particular, when Pluto went into Capricorn, we saw some big changes in the world, certainly in the financial world in 2008. Pluto doesn't leave Capricorn until 2023, 2024. So we are more than halfway through what's called the transit. It's kind of crazy to think that 2023, 2024 is not that far away. It's been a tough go of it. I think because Capricorn deals with things that are very physical, very real. It's an earth sign. So, but at the same time, structures and power and control aren't, I mean, it's not physical, but certainly it has an effect on the lives of people. So part 3, and if you all have any questions, feel free to pop it into the chat, and I will answer as I can. This is called the soul and the mirror. So because Pluto works on the level of the soul, works on the level of something much bigger and higher than this body that we inhabit, this identity that we live, our thoughts, our feelings. I think to really connect with Pluto in our chart, we need to connect with Pluto as if we are an actor on a stage, that we are going through a drama. It helps us to kind of step out of the personality part of it. It helps us to maybe see that there is a story that's unfolding that we are participating in. And the idea, hopefully, is to make new choices so that we can participate differently in this drama that's unfolding. So there's this idea that we are both an actor, but we are also witnessing at the same time. Pluto is a planet that works behind the scenes, behind the everyday. So when we are connecting with our Pluto, we are dealing with life. We're not dealing with what's called a personal planet. This is not about Mercury. It's like how you communicate. It's not about Venus, what you value, how you relate. This is something that is helping us to kind of connect to ourselves in the level of the matrix. And that's kind of a vast concept to place ourselves in, that within this life and our everyday and our choices and going to work and XYZ, that there's something that is working and grinding away beyond ourselves. And I think Pluto really helps us to connect to that level. For those, this is a little bit of an aside, for those that know what the Akashic records are, and know what that level of reality is, and the Akashic records is the library of everything that's been ever existed and thought and created. Pluto is a way to access that level of information. Pluto helps connect us to the inner workings of the soul. So this idea that you came into this lifetime, you wanted to work on something, to evolve through something, and Pluto is an expression of that desire. Depending on the sign, depending on the house, depending on the aspects that Pluto makes. And that maybe that work is not going to be easy, especially if you have very strong Pluto placements in your chart. But we know that nothing really grows unless it's really pushed, unless there's a level of adversity. It's really through that pressure that we find our growth, our transformation. And this is the way that I see Pluto. This is the way that Spirit has taught me about Pluto, is that just like we're going to that library and getting out that book that covers everything of every life that we've ever had, it helps us like a mirror to see the different facets, the different experiences, the different memories, the different emotions that make us into the totality of the soul. And that the soul is on a journey, and the soul is trying to learn different things. And maybe you're Pluto in Libra, and you have really worked on this idea of connection and relationship throughout your many lifetimes. Or it's another sign, which we'll go through in a moment. And I'm using this word soul, which is a big word. It's got a lot of oomph behind it. What does that mean? The way that I see the soul is that it's a spark of the divine that is colored by its many different lifetimes. And that we are from light, whether it's the light of the stars, the light of the Big Bang, that initial flash of light, that we all came from light. We all came from someplace. And that through our many lifetimes, our many choices, many different roles that we've played, that's colored our soul in a certain way. So Pluto helps us to connect to the many experiences of ourselves. We have to really almost meditate with our Pluto, meditate with where it is in the chart, and what sort of information can we glean about our journey through many lifetimes, and what our soul was really wanting to experience in this lifetime. Just going to go to the chat. I think if your slides are lagging, that might be a, what's it called? That might be an internet connection on your end. So you might want to try to refresh if you're having a lag. You can like restart your connection and reconnect. Sometimes when we have been an actor in many plays, many different dramatic performances, we've taken on different roles. Some of those roles weren't the type of role that we would necessarily accept in this lifetime. So there's a sense that maybe there's something within us and something within our soul's experience that we don't want to look at, we don't want to accept. So that's an energy that we might reject. We'll talk about what happens when we reject our Pluto and how it can manifest in our life in different ways. But the way that I see it maybe you feel differently, is that these different roles, these different lives that we have lived, the choices that we've made, there was a need for soul growth, there was need for new experiences. And so I think that we are at a very particular time in human history where we need to make new choices. It's not quite working the old way. Things are kind of falling apart. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the news. But I think that Pluto, because again, we're less than 100 years of Pluto having been discovered, and Pluto being this archetype that we have access to, but it's still very powerful, even as we gain new archetypes to work with. But it's a time when we really have to do our work, and this is just my personal belief, to do the work on ourselves to help humanity at this time. And when you connect with your Pluto, there's a sense of history, sense of the road traveled. If you know of other things in astrology, like the nodes, you might be wondering, how is there a difference? The way that I see the nodes talk about direction, and like a lot of the experiences that have colored that direction. But there's a sense of, there's a sense of like core lesson, core desire, core urge with Pluto versus, let's say, the nodes. For me, I take it all into account when I sit down with a chart, whether it's a client or somebody else. I'm not necessarily cherry picking. I'm taking information. I'm looking for patterns. I'm looking for a cohesive story that's supported by all the chart. Pluto, the nodes, other things that help me personally as an astrologer see the chart at the level of the soul. And so Pluto shows us where we need to continue to grow, continue to evolve in order to return back home. The way that I see it is, and I'm sure other people see it similarly, anything that, that list of words, which maybe wasn't a complete list of words in that previous slide, hatred, jealousy, etc., anything that kind of has a sense of the darkness to it, yes, it's within all of us, but these are things that take us away from connection, take us away from unity, take us away from the light, from where we came. So we want to do our personal work to move away, or release or transmute. That's why I say in my work, like, okay, now is a good day to transmute. This is the type of energies that are coming up. This is what the astrology is asking of us, so that we can all be a little bit lighter, so that we all, it's, I say this as a Scorpio, it's not to be a little kumbaya and like pretend that the darkness doesn't exist, but we have less of an attachment to it. And hopefully humanity has less of an attachment to it. And I think Pluto reminds us that in order to find the light, sometimes we have to travel through the dark. If you've been through a Pluto transit, they can sometimes really feel like a dark night of the soul. But in that moment of the dark night of the soul, we hopefully are reaching out for something more. Ooh, somebody is annotating that. I'm gonna. So when we reject our shadow, it shows up in different ways. And I think that this is why I said earlier, we really want to be mindful of our Pluto. We really want to sit with our Pluto. We really want to take consciousness of our Pluto, because there's maybe things about our Pluto and its kind of different facets that we don't want to own. And then it comes, it's like we attract somebody in our life who is the avatar of Pluto. If you came here to learn how to stand up for yourself in this lifetime, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to attract people, maybe they're bullies, maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a parent, who is the avatar of this Pluto lesson, so that you can hopefully, it doesn't make it easy, I don't say this without any compassion, of course, is that, again, we're just kind of witnessing Pluto, that you learn to stand up for yourself. You learn to transform hatred into love, transform jealousy into more of a detached acceptance. You learn to build something that is based on tolerance and acceptance instead of something that's based on abuse or oppression. You know, and the other reason why I was doing this webinar at this time was because the lunar eclipse on July 16th, so as we record this, just a few days away, is making what's called a conjunction to Pluto. So Pluto energy is very strong right now, and if you're watching this live or you're listening to it on the replay, my advice right now is to really look for subtext in everything. Look for if you are acting out a certain way, if you are feeling something, what's the subtext to it? What's the hidden lesson? I think that's what I've seen with myself or seen with other people. It's like when we don't claim our power, somebody else is going to claim the power for us. If we don't, if we're not integrated, if there's like even like a very simple basic level, it's the person that is secretly very creative, very talented, very artistic, but for whatever reason is not accepting their creative talents and abilities, and they keep attracting people into their life who are very talented, very creative. This is a very positive form of Pluto coming in. It's like this reminder on your soul, like you really want to express your creativity. So be careful, or maybe be more aware, I think is a better way of putting it, of what you're rejecting right now, what you're being like, oh, that's not me, or that's, you know, or that person, oh, that's, you know, that's not good. And what is that saying about you? Because right now, the energy of the shadow is really saturated in the collective right now. Because we're doing, when we come up to this full moon in a few days, this is a really beautiful and powerful time to let go of a lot of old stuff. Wait, where's my cursor? Hang on, guys. My cursor just decided to Mercury retrograde. Two seconds, guys. I don't know why. I'm having some Mercury retrograde right now. Wait, maybe that's it? I got my mouse back. I think I got my mouse back. Yeah, I got my mouse back. All right, my mouse went away. Where were we? So, you know, there's a personal level of Pluto, but there's also a collective level. So that's why I was saying earlier that collectively right now with Pluto and Capricorn, we're collectively working on looking at the darkness of Capricorn, looking at the darkness of matter, looking at the darkness of our institutions, our governments, our structures, and then hopefully reforming them, transforming them, transmuting them, taking the denser energy and making it lighter. And there's a sense of personal and collective karma with Pluto. You know, we all are connected right now to, you know, some sort of karma around Capricorn. And so we can contribute in different ways. We can contribute unconsciously, which means we're feeding the kind of the negativity of Capricorn, these old structures, these old oppressions, or we can choose something different and feed it with, you know, light, which then makes it dissolve. So Pluto at birth, we're gonna do like a little bit of an overview of what Pluto means in the birth chart. We could, like I said earlier, we could talk about this for 5 hours. So this is meant to just give you a start, an overview. I'm purposely not talking about aspects because that could be an hour, but we'll look at it by house and sign. So when we are born, Pluto occupies a place in the chart, and that place is very important. It shows where we're doing a lot of deep work to grow and evolve. And so by sign and by house, it's showing us these themes that we're working on and we're evolving through on a soul level. So when you look at Pluto, you look at Pluto in your charts, try to see it like you're watching a play. Try to take the I out of it. Try to, if you've been through some difficult experiences, how would you narrate this if you were narrating it about somebody else? It just helps us to depersonalize. It helps us to see an invisible. Remember, I said how Pluto can act like almost like invisible. In fact, in the myth, I think Pluto had like a hat that he wore that made him invisible when he was in the when he was out of the underworld. But it just, when we have that sense of detachment and depersonalization, it helps us to see something that's unfolding in our chart that is beyond the self, beyond the ego. The ego is not the soul. The soul is something much higher. And so we might find that we're working through the more difficult aspects of that sign or that house, but it's all in my view, this idea that we're trying to find the higher expression. Where, again, if you are trying to learn how to find your power in this lifetime, you might have different experiences repeated about not having power until you truly, fully come into your own with that Pluto in that part of your chart. And this is soul growth. And maybe if you look back on your lives, maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe there's been a lot of soul growth, because the astrology right now is not easy. I know I keep getting asked, like, when is it going to get easier? But I sadly, I think this is a bit of a trend. I think we are in a very particular passage of time where, we, especially in the New Age community, it was everybody about ascension and everything's like, oh, everything's going to get better, we're going to ascend. But the reality, it's like the hard work now. We have to really put light within this kind of matrix of reality where there hasn't been light ever before. So I know there's kind of a wide swath of people at different ages that may be watching this webinar. So if you are Pluto in Leo generation, which means that you were born in the 40s or 50s, you're part of a collective experience where you're facing the dark side of the ego. And this can kind of come up in a lot of different ways. One, you might have not really found your ego, or found like the positive ego, like found your creative talent, because Leo is creativity, is passion, it's self-expression. And maybe you've been cut off from that, or maybe you've been in like a maybe less than helpful or more destructive, because sometimes Pluto and Leo, it can be that like self-destructive tendencies. It's interesting that rock and roll as we know it, I mean, certainly rock and roll has deeper roots, really came out of this Pluto and Leo time, this really like fermented creative period for music and art, and was this obsession with youth. Sometimes with Pluto, there's a sense of obsession. I should also put that in there. And this is really just, by the way, we're talking about a collective experience. The sign gives you an energy. The planet gives you the type of experience that is expressed through that sign. And then the house, this is like some intermediate astrology, and the house tells you where it's happening. House is location. So if you're Pluto and Virgo generation, and I should also add that the like 1958, 1972, or the 1939, 1958 in the previous slide, it's approximate. There were some retrogrades where Pluto dipped back into Leo before going back into Virgo. So these are just approximate dates. If you know your chart, you know your astrology, you'll have a little bit more information. So Pluto in Virgo, facing the dark side of order. Virgo is a sign that editorializes, meaning it has a sense of order. Certain things go certain places. And even if that order is built on oppression, intolerance, the 1960s, early 1970s were a time of great social upheaval. mind you, Uranus was also in Pluto at the same. Uranus was in Virgo at the same time, but it exposed on a very mundane, everyday level where order was not working out for everybody. We saw kind of the dark side of, let's say, racism or segregation, and so it was a time when, on the collective level, we needed to look at that and make some changes. So Pluto in Libra, 1972 to 1984, approximately, facing the dark side of relationships. I should also add that Pluto in your chart, you might find that it all kind of comes back to that Pluto. For me, like, I'm Pluto in Libra generation. It's like it always comes back to relationships. It's like that thing that I can't quite escape. Maybe you're Pluto in Virgo. Virgo is also health and wellness. It's work, it's projects. Maybe it's, at the end of the day, like how you show up in that everyday life. It always kind of keeps coming back to that. And so relationships, if you're Pluto and Libra generation, that's an area where you're going to find a lot of soul growth happen. And the same logic, of course, for the other signs. Pluto in Scorpio, 1984 to 1995. It's facing the dark side of the dark side. I know that's kind of I say this as a Scorpio. That time was it was a time of AIDS. Scorpio talks about the things that we're not supposed to talk about in polite company. It was a sense of the secrets and the things that normally are in the shadows are now in the news cycle. They're very much front and center. And I think that, and I'm kind of borrowing a phrase from another astrologer, when she talks about Pluto and Scorpio, she talks about this idea of an annihilation consciousness, that there's this whole generation of people that back in the deep parts of their soul, they know what the energy of annihilation is, that life can go away at any moment. The Pluto and Scorpio generation, it's just starting to come into its own. It's already had its Saturn, like the earlier side has already had its Saturn return, but kind of getting towards the midpoint of Pluto and Scorpio generation. It'll be interesting to see what this generation brings to adulthood, to the collective, to powers, to structures. Certainly, I think that there's going to be a very different relationship with sexuality and intimacy and the things that we don't normally talk about, as they start to come into positions of power in the world. Right now it's more like Pluto and Virgo are in the kind of reigns of power. Pluto and Leo is kind of stepping to the side. Pluto and Libra is just starting to step into higher positions of power. And I think that where our Pluto is really does affect how if we are a leader, if we are a president, or if we are making the rules, that it really does affect how we show up. And Pluto and Libra is about fairness and equity. So, in its highest expression, of course. So from 1995 to 2008, Pluto is in Sagittarius, facing the dark side of belief. And we saw the rise of fundamentalism and this idea that religion can be deadly. So on a collective level, we are all really working to transform how we saw the world. But in order to transform the way that we see the world, we have to see how we are being very limited in how we see the world, whether it's our beliefs, our faith, our religion, where we all have those moments of being a fundamentalist about something. So this kind of was a time when we all had to collectively work on this energy. I didn't include Pluto and Capricorn, and this is more for the people. There might be some people that are born with Pluto and Sagittarius. The bulk of you probably are Leo through Scorpio, and maybe you have children with Pluto and Sagittarius. Pluto and Capricorn, that's a pretty intense energy where we've been feeling it the last 11 years. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when these children grow up and start to assume the reins of power. It's like, do they use that higher side of Pluto to really clear away the darkness in our structures, or are they still maintaining it unconsciously or consciously? So if you have Pluto in the first house, you are learning to transform your relationship with power. The first house, you have to remember, first house is Aries, it's Mars, just in its natural state. And it's a place where we really find our drive and our motivation and our courage to move forward. And if you have Pluto in the first house, that you, in a way, you are Pluto. And I once said that to somebody, and they got a little offended, and I'm like, that's that's nothing to be offended about. Like the highest form of Pluto is to really master the being in your power and empowering others. But you might be learning some deeper lessons about your own power if you have Pluto in the first house. I also sometimes find that people with Pluto in the first house, they can be a little polarizing. Like sometimes people don't always get them, and sometimes you are that mirror for people, so you're reflecting things back to them that they are just not able to see. So you have to understand that you just might have this very intense energy that's running through your chart with Pluto in what's called the first house. Pluto in the second house, transforming our relationship with money. The second house is also, of course, what we value, what we own, how we accumulate resource. So there's some sort of deeper soul lesson about how do you, what do you value? What do you own? What's your relationship with the material world? What's your relationship with money? Pluto in the third house, transforming our relationship with communication. The third house is also the mind, how we think, how we learn, how we take in information. So there's this idea that Pluto in the third, there's a deep work of transformation about how we communicate, how we use our voice, how we express our ideas. And as we go through different signs, you might feel that it's describing how you're not using that house. So maybe there's something you have to learn to kind of come into your power in that part of your life, or maybe you're using that Pluto in a way that hasn't been the most helpful in the past. Pluto in the fourth house, transforming our relationship with emotional connection. Note that I didn't say normal fourth house stuff, which is family and home and all that stuff. But I think really at the core of the fourth house experience is emotional connection. It is where the moon naturally is at home. It's about roots. It's about feeling like we're not alone. But that said, there might be a story around connection. There might be a story around family and emotions and feeling like we are kind of safe on an emotional level. Pluto in the fifth house, transforming our relationship with the self. The fifth house is where we find identity in our persona. It's something that's a little bit more constructed than, say, the first, which is very much about instinct. So Pluto in the fifth, we have to really come into our own around our talents and our creativity. Maybe we're disconnected from it. Maybe we are self-destructive. Sometimes I've seen Pluto in the fifth with people that have maybe at different times in their life been very self-destructive, whether through substance. That's not necessarily the case with everybody. I'm just kind of putting that out there. But there's a sense of like destroying the self, destroying the ego. Death and rebirth is very much wrapped up in the persona. But it's like, how do you have more of a healthier expression of that Pluto in the fifth? Like maybe just oodles of creativity. So Pluto in the sixth house, transforming our relationship with daily life. Pluto in the sixth house can also show up with people who are learning really deep and powerful lessons around work. And the sixth house is the house of servants. So sometimes we get into these subservient relationships. And so there's a sense of needing to really find your power in an area. Like the sixth house is so mundane. It's like daily life, it's work, it's health. It could even be, there is a deeper soul story around how you take care of the body, how you take care of your daily life. How connected are you? So Pluto in the seventh house, transforming our relationship with other people. The seventh house is a house of socialization. It's where we meet the quote unquote the other. And so Pluto is, we have to do a lot of deep transformation work through our relationships. We may literally meet Pluto through our various relationships. We may be married to Pluto. We might be in a deep committed relationship with Pluto. And so we just need to be aware of like what that partner, what that mate, what that person is reflecting back to us. Do we need to change how we connect and do relationships? Do we need to find our empowerment in relationship? Pluto in the eighth house, transforming our relationship with our deepest self. The eighth house is an area where we, much to kind of these similar topics with Pluto and the psyche, it's where we meet our deepest self. It's all the deep, dark corners of us. And if Pluto is there, there's some deep material for you to work with in this lifetime. Maybe there's been, true to Pluto and true to the eighth house, issues of shame, issues of secrecy, intimacy, things that have been repressed. So that's an area that you're doing a lot of work on. The eighth house is also money and finance and assets. So there's a sense of, connection to like the power of money, the power of assets. Pluto in the ninth house, transforming our relationship with how we see the world. The ninth house, of course, is higher education and beliefs and wisdom and knowledge. But it's also where how we kind of, the experiences that shape how we see the world. Do we see the world as a fearful place? Do we not want to travel? Does travel profoundly transform us? Pluto in the ninth. Maybe there's some deeper story around what you believe in, what you've put your faith in, or how you've maybe been disconnected from belief and faith. Pluto in the 10th house, transforming our relationship with the world. The 10th house is a very public house. It's the highest house in the chart. People, if you have Pluto in the 10th, maybe you are Pluto on a professional level. Maybe you've encountered Pluto out in the world. But I think that ultimately Pluto, kind of like Pluto in the first, you're learning to find your power in the world. But of course, which level of power? Because power, as we know with Pluto and Capricorn, it can be power that destroys instead of power that uplifts. And I think that Pluto in the 10th is that you're really learning to step into your own in this lifetime, but you might have experiences that really force you to evolve in this part of your life. Pluto in the 11th house, transforming our relationship with society. The 11th house is friendships, it's groups, it's like socialization on a greater level. But I feel sometimes with Pluto in the 11th house, there's these deeper soul themes around feeling like you belong. I think that, picking up on some of that root Aquarius energy in the 11th, there's a sense of sometimes alienation. So maybe you're working through deep themes on a soul level around connection, alienation versus feeling like you're part of something. Issues of power on a collective level. Do you trust the group? Do you trust your friends? Because there's a sense of friendship is also rooted in the 11th house as well. Pluto in the 12th house, transforming our relationship with what's hidden. Pluto is very behind the scenes, like very, very behind the scenes in the 12th house. It shows up in dreams. It's the 12th house is a place that's unconscious. It's hidden. 12th house is also spirituality. It kind of connects us to something greater than ourselves. So if you have Pluto on the 12th, there might be things that you have to really dig deep to find in this lifetime. Maybe there's stuff that you need to connect to or transform that's been so buried deep in the self. So maybe it kind of comes out in those intense dreams or those intense nightmares. And so what are maybe you're using dream work as a way of accessing your Pluto. It's like, what is your deepest, most hidden part of yourself trying to teach you about what your soul needs to grow and transform in this lifetime. So now, we're going to look at Pluto as, let's say, the arc of time, this idea of Pluto as a transit. Because Pluto time can be a very long, concentrated period of time. So Pluto will spend years helping, and I put helping in air quotes, us to work through the deeper themes of the sign so that we can evolve on a soul level. And I think that when we we are looking at our life and our chart from the level of the matrix, not necessarily from the level of the I, the ego, or the self, we can start to see that Pluto is helping us, it's not easy, grow and evolve through some sort of theme. And like I said, at the time, it does not feel like helping. If you've gone through a Pluto transit, it can sometimes be some of the most difficult astrology that you go through. If you are a Capricorn or a Cancer, maybe even if you're a Libra or an Aries, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, because these are the 4 signs, but in particular Capricorn and Cancer, that have been pushed the most in the last decades. Decade singular. And true to the myth of Pluto, true to the myth of the Lord of the Underworld, he dragged Persephone into the underworld. We sometimes feel like we're being pulled into something. I think with the Pluto transit, that means when Pluto goes through a certain part of your chart at a certain point of your life, you just have to surrender. I don't think you can fight it. I think there's something that is much bigger than us that's happening. And this is just the reality. I mean, I'm saying this as a Scorpio. I say this with love. There's times when we have to face the darker side of life. I don't know if I've met anybody whose life is just like they're just laying on the beach the whole time. I don't know. Maybe there's somebody out there that just has it like really easy this lifetime, because they're just resting and preparing for the next one. But there's going to be points where in our life where things get difficult, where we have to face the darker side of life, and these are these key moments that really deeply transform us on a soul level. And when we go through these darker moments in life, we may have to face something that we haven't wanted to face before. It might be a repressed emotion, repressed feeling. It might be something from childhood that we've just completely walled away as a means of survival. But it means that there's something within our system, something within our unconscious that we're not dealing with, that we're not healing. And so Pluto comes to a certain part of our chart, and it, quote unquote, helps us to face that. So it's not easy, but I think that if you're going through a Pluto transit, the best thing that you can do is make sure you have allies, make sure you have guides, friends, therapists, other sorts of practitioners that can help guide you through this process of going into your underworld so that you can have this experience, transform, face what you need to face, release what you need to release. Whether it's a crying, like sometimes Pluto transit or Pluto energy, like you're vomiting. Like there's a sense of like volcanic energy with Pluto. It's like something that's been like held down deep down inside, just completely comes out suddenly. But there's this idea that a Pluto transit really brings us into this process of death and rebirth. I think it's important to realize that, and this is the case with every planet in astrology and every transit that you will experience, it always goes back to the natal placement. So you may be a Cancer, maybe you just had a birthday around right now, or you're a Capricorn that's born around the beginning of January, or the middle of, I guess like this, we're getting up to like the middle of January at this point with the Pluto transit. And regardless of what you're experiencing right now, it always touches back on where it is in your natal chart. If you are experiencing something right now and you have like with a Pluto transit and you are Pluto and Scorpio generation, you're going to feel it on the level of Scorpio. That's where it is in your chart. for your Pluto and Libra generation. It's going to take you back to that Pluto and Libra relationships. So this is like my quick nod to Pluto transit of a planet in the chart. When Pluto makes a conjunction, this is like some technical astrology. If Pluto makes a conjunction, a square, or an opposition, I'm counting the hard aspects in this thing. The planet has to profoundly transform. If you have a moon in Capricorn right now, I'm having a lot of clients right now who have moon between 22, 24 Capricorn, how they feed themselves, how they nurture themselves has to profoundly transform. And then if, just for those wondering, well, what about a trine or what about a sextile? There's still a process that's happening when Pluto trines a planet or sextiles. I mean, a sextile is very quiet. Sextile is the energy of Venus. Sextile is like putting a chocolate on your pillow and making sure you're tucked in, making sure everything goes smoothly. So there might be just like a really behind the scenes, like a very quiet experience with Pluto trine to a planet. But a trine, has the energy of Jupiter in a trine. So there might be like an easier opening of a planet and the planet's experiences and the transformation of that planet with a trine versus, say, a square or an opposition. And because Pluto moves so slowly, you might have what's called an aspect to Pluto to a planet in your chart. You'll never have that again in your life because it takes 248 years to go around the chart. When Pluto touches something in our astrology, there can be a sense of breakdown. Something is irrevocably changed. That's that sense of death and rebirth. Just checking the chat. Karina is sharing about her own experience with her own Pluto in the 11th house. So, yeah, it's good to see what this is triggering in you as you think about it, and you might want to go back and see what this, like when you watch this again, and see what it brings up for you. So Pluto also helps us to make us face our proverbial demons, our shadow self, our unhealed self. I put demons in air quotes. We all have, you know what your demons are. Maybe it's your shame, maybe it's your anger, maybe it's your jealousy. And so Pluto helps us to connect to that level. And I think that when Pluto initiates us into something, and it takes us where we can face our shadow. Otherwise, it's in the unconscious. It's out of focus. We can't realize it. So we need, at these times, we need Pluto to lead us into the underworld, lead us into our underworld. Otherwise, we wouldn't go there. Otherwise, we wouldn't face it. I say lead because sometimes it can feel like not a gentle experience. It might feel that we're actually being kind of taken against our will into our underworld. So this is kind of the crux of things. It's like once we see something, just like that first slide when we saw Pluto, literally saw the planet Pluto 4.5 billion miles away. The science is amazing, by the way. We can't unsee it. Something has been put into our awareness. And then this is the thing, when we can name it as shame, we can name it as jealousy or hatred or oppression. It no longer, this idea that the demon no longer has power over us. And then when we can name it, when we can see it, when we can put it into our consciousness and our awareness, it's like turning lead into gold. This idea that Pluto is really helping us to have soul alchemy at this point in our life. I do want to quickly talk about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction this year, next year, because there's some stuff that's going on. I think that kind of colors some of the things that we're experiencing with Pluto. Saturn and Pluto are making a rare alignment. This doesn't happen very often. It happens every 40 years. And the last time Saturn and Pluto were together in the sky was 1982, 1983 in Libra. If you were born in 1982 or 1983, you have what's called Saturn conjunct Pluto in your chart. So it takes another nearly 40 years for this to happen again. And then here they are. Saturn and Pluto are together in the signs of Capricorn. Libra is an air sign, and Capricorn is an earth sign. So the experience of this conjunction is very different than it was in the 82, 83. Like now it's happening in earth. Now it's happening with our structures, with our government. But even on a personal level, what I've been noticing is this idea that Capricorn, our Capricorn energy in our chart, there's a rigidity there. It's very concrete, for better or for worse. It's, like I said, it's a sign of matter. So yes, Pluto has been in Capricorn since 2008, and now Saturn is there too. So I feel like I've been seeing this in my client work. I've been feeling this myself. It's like Saturn and Pluto together, because it's earth energy, it's structures. It's almost like here comes this wrecking ball. And I've noticed that this is maybe what's coming up with my client work, and maybe you're feeling this the same as well. These structures that we've built individually in our life, could be a job, could be a marriage, could be a whole way of seeing yourself or seeing the world or taking care of your body, for instance. And here comes Saturn and Pluto, and it's like whacking at these structures. And there's a sense of anxiety. So if you're Capricorn right now, I think you're having some very difficult astrology, and it's time to give all your Capricorn friends a big hug, because I think that this is really going against Capricorn's nature, is to build and to construct. But here comes the wrecking ball. I think that it's just not a time where we can keep clinging out of fear to these old structures, because the wrecking ball is going to come again, and we're going to have less and less and less to hold on to. Which is why, I'm telling people that this is, if we could just use this energy like a sledgehammer, meaning we are empowering ourselves with it, it makes it a much different process. We're putting our consciousness in it. If you have fears around being yourself, being seen, maybe you have all these talents, and you get in your way, that demon around, oh, you're not good enough, comes in, and you keep stopping yourself over and over again. What if you took a sledgehammer to it? What if you made this something you did during the eclipse, where you need to bring this energy into the physical and destroy something? It could be a plate, it could be a glass, as a way of symbolizing breaking these old structures. Just checking the chat. Yeah, big hugs to anybody who is a Capricorn right now, especially for those who have angles or stelliums or other major planets in Capricorn. I think Capricorn and Gemini are actually getting it, and Cancer, I would say, as well. It's kind of a tough go of things for these signs. So again, turning shadows into light, part 6. This idea of what do we do with all this energy, or this awareness. And I was just saying a few moments ago that with the eclipse, what if we, because Saturn and Pluto, there's such a deep physicality to their placement together in Capricorn, what if we symbolized that old structure of our life, and we, I don't know, maybe this is very Scorpio of me. I'm what if we crushed it? What if we, just to symbolize and to bring into the material world that something about us needs to change. And, I see it with my client work. It's somebody will come to me and they're trying to, you can't see my hands right now, but it's like you're trying to be little. You're trying to contort yourself into a shape or a space that just doesn't fit you anymore. And so what if you liberated yourself from this old structure? So what if like you use that energy of the eclipse up actually to transmute it on a physical level? At the end of the day, Pluto is a work of consciousness, which is to say Pluto in your chart, in order to really truly be at the level that Pluto needs us to be, we need to recognize that there's something that's happening. We need to take consciousness. If you are Pluto in Libra, maybe start to look at all your relationships and all your interactions with this detached observer, standpoint. Maybe if you're Pluto in Leo, maybe look at yourself, look at the ego from a very detached way. How would you see yourself in a play? How would you see yourself as a performer? Pluto in Virgo, how are you working too much? How are you taking on too much responsibility? How are you dealing with issues of power and control? How are you participating in old structures or old orders that need to change and reform? Pluto in Scorpio, how are you facing your darkness? What's in there that needs to be let go of for the good of humanity? I think Pluto shows us where we can't avoid, and that's the thing. You can avoid. You can try to avoid all you want, and Pluto will show up in your life like an avatar in different ways. If you, this is like a personal share, I kept attracting people into my life who had anger issues, and was like, what's up with that? And then I realized that I wasn't owning my own anger, that there was something deep within me that I had repressed, that these people were the avatars. Maybe you keep attracting narcissists in your life. Well, a narcissist is going to gladly be you and take up all that space because you are not being you. You are not claiming yourself. These are just a couple of examples. So I think that what I'm asking, at least I think what Pluto is asking on a deeper level, is that we need to become aware of ourselves on a new level. How do we still know who we are. We're still inhabiting our bodies. We're still showing up every day. But how do we see ourselves on the level of the matrix? This idea that there's something that's happening that we're participating in, but that there's like another level, another layer of awareness. If the matrix is one way of looking at it, but this idea that there's a drama that's happening, you're an actor. What if you put yourself from the perspective of the audience? What sort of drama would you be seeing? What sort of roles would you be seeing yourself playing out? How do you start to create new roles or new experiences? And again, we all have darkness. I'm pretty sure nobody here on this call, I'm not certainly a saint. We all have something that plugs into an energy that is present in this world, whether we like it or not. All those words, the hatred that I showed in that earlier slide, the hatred, the jealousy, the oppression, the anger. We have to own that there's something within us that connects to that. And sometimes that realization is hard. We don't want to, for me, like I didn't want to admit that there was an anger in me that was being suppressed or not connected to that these other people in my life were, I didn't want to admit that there was that level of rage in me. And that's hard, that's confrontational. But as I was saying, if we can depersonalize, we take the ego or the self out of it, it helps us to gain a new perspective on our chart, a new perspective on our Pluto and the aspects that our Pluto is making. And as I was saying earlier, if you are not owning something that's in your shadow, that's in your unconscious, somebody else will gladly own it for you. And so we can get into these very tricky situations where we keep repeating and working out similar situations. So my hope is that we have some aha moments. We kind of see, we suddenly, it's like we shift our eyes, we shift our consciousness, we shift our perspective on reality, and we see something for what it is. Another person will share. When I started doing astrology, and this was, I guess, 10 years ago at this point, I was terrified of my name being out there. At first, when Empowering Astrology first launched, my name was nowhere to be found. My picture was nowhere to be found. I had this like irrational fear that people would just like show up on my doorstep with the pitchforks and the torches, and they were gonna like drag me into the street and kill me. Okay, maybe there's another lifetime in that, but so as I would start to make these furtive steps out to the world and to put my name on my stuff, I would attract people who would like be very negative for me being an astrologer. When I taught my first class ever in person in 2013, it was through an organization here in Brooklyn that lets you teach classes. And I got this email from somebody. It was like this nasty email about how could this organization in Brooklyn allow an astrologer to teach a class, and how that had brought down his opinion of the organization. And he literally said this to me. He said, "What do you have to say for yourself?" And the reason I'm sharing this is that I was not owning my talent. I was not owning my power. I was terrified of stepping into something that now is a heck of a lot more natural for me. And so I was attracting the avatars of my fear. And even when, last March, when I went into full-time work, left my day job of 12 years, that was a huge step, of course, but like I attracted somebody into my life that like basically told me I was terrible at what I did. But there was a moment where I kind of laughed in my head, where I was like, oh, here I am, I'm about to take a big step in my life, and here's Pluto again. And this is the drama that's happening. This is drama that's happened before. And I can see it for what it is and not get bothered by it. I mean, I got bothered by it, but I saw that there was still that thing, that deep story about owning my talents and owning my power. I'm just going to check the chat. I'm just reading a comment. Hang on, guys. Somebody's feeling confused in regards to if Pluto is in Capricorn, that meaning affects each. Sorry, I have to like put my glasses on. It's tiny type. If Pluto is in Capricorn, that means affects each of us according to where our own Pluto is. For example, I have Pluto and Virgo in the 8th house, and that will encompass themes related to Pluto and Capricorn. It's a little bit of a nuanced point that I'm trying to make, and maybe that's a little confusing right now. You always start with where Pluto is, what's called by transit. So wherever Pluto is, and if you, I don't know what your rising sign is, but if you have Pluto going through, okay, I'm just making an example. If you have Pluto going through the 5th house right now, you're learning some really powerful examples about owning your talents and being yourself. Saturn and Pluto are there. You're trying to break down these old structures that made you think you weren't good enough or you couldn't do a certain thing. But at the end of the day, there's a sense of like you have Pluto in the 8th. Again, this is just an example. I don't have a chart in front of me. Where you have to, if somebody's Pluto in the 8th, then maybe there's some really deep fears. There might even be trauma that's preventing somebody from being in that 5th house energy. I'm just like totally making a riff for an example here. So that's what I mean by just go back to the house. But if these are too many moving parts, just start simple. Start with getting to know your Pluto and your birth chart. And then know that Pluto is in Capricorn, that something's happening there. And then when you get comfortable with like these moving parts and the different intricacies and subtleties, of all these different energies, where you can start to create a more nuanced picture, then bring in that other stuff. But that's the thing about astrology, is that it's a lot of different moving parts, and you could weave in a lot of different things to make a story. But the most important thing is to focus on is like, where is your Pluto? What is it that you are experiencing from on the totality of your life? And then knowing that at times in your life, Pluto is going to go through different parts of your chart. And then you're going to have a deep level of transformation and evolution that's required of you while Pluto is in that sign or that house, depending on what house systems you use. Just gonna close the chat. So to that point, there's a core lesson in your chart that I think Pluto really talks about. And I think that if you can find that core lesson, you'll see how that it's really at the root of everything. And whether it's to that earlier example that I gave, if you have Pluto in the 8th, if that core lesson is about to find healing and transformation and evolution, and find your power in the 8th, your positive power in the 8th, then that's going to be kind of at the root of every experience that you have, because that's your soul really needs to find its power, find its healing, to heal maybe some darknesses that one has experienced throughout different parts of this life or other lifetimes. It helps you to, like I said in my example with myself, I see these things keep coming up. What changes is my experience, my consciousness, and how I interact with the same button that gets pressed over and over again. So, fingers crossed, I'm doing my Pluto work, Pluto in Libra, learning to find my power and how I interact with people, interact with relationships, how I socialize. And it's in a particular part of my chart. So then that tells me where this is happening. I happen to have Pluto in the 10th house. So this is happening on a very public, very professional career level. If we wanted, for those who are more advanced, I would say when you start to look at the aspects that your Pluto makes and the ruler that your Pluto, like what's going on with that ruler, what aspects that ruler is making, it's going to give you a much more richer picture. If this is like, that's a lot of moving parts, come to that earlier question, that's going to make you confused. So this is for those who have kind of integrated of more like what the different parts in astrology mean. But this is like how you can start to build a more nuanced picture of what you are learning. And here's the thing, and I say this as a professional astrologer, I'm still learning my chart. The same chart that I've been looking at since I was like, 13, 14 years old, I'm still seeing things. My ability to connect, to have consciousness, to experience different parts of my life, different parts of the chart has changed because I have grown and evolved. And that's why I always say, astrology is just energy. The chart is just energy. It's just a container. What astrology does not measure is our consciousness. That's why you can have two people born the same day, at the same time, and there's some similarities, of course, but they're different people, because at the end of the day, they're growing and evolving and making choices how to live this life, different ways. This is why you can see twins just be like, almost like different, it's different souls, of course. So I always talk about this idea of choice, that you can kind of continue to push the things aside that you don't want to deal with. And I say this like, no judgment, totally with love, say this to myself, or we can face it. And I think that because we're dealing with a lot of Pluto energy right now, in particular with this eclipse, and in different points throughout this year because of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, if you can just go for it 1,000%, just say screw it and get out the sledgehammer and just start proverbially knocking down all those walls, those barriers, those structures, I mean, if you want a relationship in your life, and the reality is there's a lot of wall, there's a lot of barrier, emotional and psychic barrier for people to get into your life, get into your heart. How do you make a choice to use this Pluto energy, to work with Pluto, to bring down that wall, to bring down that blocks? I mean, have a client, she's got all these talents, but she's afraid to embody them. But there's some shame that's kind of getting in the way. And it's like, how do you use this time, this energy, just to really let go of that shame? Otherwise, shame, of course, is the shadow. It's a block. So anything that's really preventing you from being your best self, your real you, the connections you want, the desires you want, look at how Pluto is guiding you through this time and what you can really tear down and transform. And so, right now we're going through what's called a Pluto transit. So this is a time when Pluto is really highlighted, but there's going to be points throughout your life where you face Pluto. You kind of get in connection with that Pluto energy. And so that's, there might be times when you're really doing a lot of deep transformation work, especially my Capricorns right now, big hugs. And then there's other times when you're not. But there will be maybe times during the month or times during the year when we have certain transits or certain full moons or new moons that bring us back to that root thing that we're all dealing with. And that's, again, it's all about choice. What will you choose? Astrology is a circle, and how many times are you going to go around the circle? Do you do it this time? Do you do the next time? Do you wait? So I'm personally of the type where, like right now with the Pluto stuff, I'm trying to go at it as hard as I can, because I know that this is a really powerful time to do so. So if you have any questions, then now is definitely the time. Let's stop sharing my screen so I can say hi to you all. Is my camera on? No, my video is. Here's my video. So let me just go back to the messages. There's a question about Pluto dominating a stellium. So Mercury, Venus, that's a lot of Pluto. If you have Pluto in a stellium, the kind of the conventional wisdom is that there's some sort of evolution work that you're doing around those other planets. In this case, Venus and Scorpio, Mercury, and the Sun. So Sun Pluto can be very creative. It can be somebody that just has this like endless creativity, endless expression of self. I have Venus and Scorpio too as well. So I wonder if you have Pluto conjunct the Sun and Scorpio. I would say that you're somebody that potentially can have a great impact with yourself, your expression, your persona, what you're creating. Maybe there's some shadow work, meaning that you are not stepping into it, or you are stepping into it, or it's being used in a certain way. And sometimes Pluto in the fifth is, again, self-destruction. Like, how do you destroy yourself? How do you get caught in these cycles? Pluto is an energy. It's like you have to harness it. You have to see where it's taking you away, and then work with it in consciousness to use it as a powerful force. This is why Pluto unconsciously can disempower. Pluto consciously can empower. So hopefully that answers your question. If there are any other questions, and again, put them in the chat. And if you were a little bit past the 90-minute mark, or like 15 minutes past the 90-minute mark, if you are watching the replay, definitely send me your questions via email. That's how we can all kind of still participate, even if you're watching the replay. Just to recap, Pluto is both a planet, but it's also helping us to connect to an energy that is present in everything. It's helping us to connect with our shadow. It's helping us to see the things that we are not seeing, the things that we are repressing, the things that we are cutting off. And then in some cases, when we really aren't owning certain things that are like within us, we attract Pluto as that avatar, Pluto as the bully, Pluto as somebody that tries to disempower us so that we can be empowered. We can find our power, we can find our creativity, we can find our passion, our joy. I think that if you can harness that Pluto stellium in the fifth, it could be deeply, positively, creatively. I don't know if you do anything creative, for the person that's asking. So again, my name is Katie Sweetman with Empowering Astrology. Look, one last question. Pluto conjunct the Sun. That, in a way, and I'm just kind of saying this as a Scorpio, there, and I'm assuming you're a Capricorn, you are in a process of dying. And I know that I say that metaphorically, of course. My friends who are Capricorn that I'm seeing with Pluto going over the sun right now, it's hard because I think that because the sun is the ego, the sun really identifies with living life and expressing the self in a certain way. And Pluto is just like tearing everything down around you, why I think it's such a difficult transit. And so how do you surrender to this process? How do you go into a process where you know that you have to become a new person? You almost, in a way, have to kill off yourself. But knowing that what emerges through this process, like this thing about Pluto, is that it takes away the things that are no longer supporting us. Doesn't matter if we identify with it, doesn't matter if we want it or need it. But Pluto has this awareness of what we need on a much higher level. So we might see a job and a marriage, and there's a sense of these things that are leaving our life, these structures that are leaving our life right now. So for the sun, it's very much about the self. I think with the person in my life that I'm thinking of, I think that she really has to surrender into this process that the person that she was up until this point doesn't exist anymore, or at least that's the idea. And that's can be very scary to have to proverbially die. But you will get through this. You will come out of this other side. I had Pluto to the sun as a child, so I don't have any personal adult experience with it. I had Pluto opposite the moon in 2006, 2007, and that was some of the most difficult astrology that I ever went through. So if you have Pluto to the moon, I mean, at the time I discovered the joys of therapy, but if you have Pluto to the moon right now, really releasing and letting go of all this emotional material, all the things that you're not facing, all the traumas. In a way, when you have a Pluto transit, you're kind of going into your hell. And then there's the reemergence. And then this is why I say the Pluto initiates, because through these experiences, you will never be the same. It's a staggering statement, blunt statement, but there's that faith. I mean, I know we're talking about Pluto. I don't use Pluto as the modern ruler of Scorpio. I use Mars. But, when astrology, the zodiac is a wheel of life. It's every experience that you can possibly have as a human being on this planet and in this world. And when you go through Scorpio, the 8th house, in that natural chart, that natural step of evolution and progression, you have to have that. You have to get to Sagittarius, which is the next sign. The Sagittarius, the 9th house, is the next place after Scorpio and the 8th. it's an act of faith to go through the 8th house. And my joke is that Sagittarius didn't get its wisdom without having to go through Scorpio. So this is this idea that all of our Pluto experiences that we go through, whether they're small, whether they're big, um, it's ultimately a soul growth, but a soul wisdom. And whatever you're going through, Kimberly, or anybody else that's listening that's going through a difficult transit right now, I mean, it's easier said than done. I mean, I've been through it, so I know. It's a type of wisdom that you would never have gotten either way. And I think the key, the linchpin, is what you do with it, because you can go and spend the rest of your life trying to get back to where you were, but it doesn't exist anymore. Or you can have that courage to go forward and to find a new expression of self, a new expression of relationship, a new expression of life. You know, sometimes with Pluto in the 8th, you're so connected to death that you forget to live. So we are living through a very interesting time in history, where I'm using astrology as a tool. There's different tools, there's different modalities, but I think whatever you're using, how do you help yourself, which is helping the world, meaning the work that you do for yourself to find your power, to leave behind these old structures, gives other people courage. Be a positive example for your friends, your peers, your family, and then, I don't know, maybe this world will be like a little bit of a better place during this time. So unless there are any other questions, I will wrap up the webinar. Thank you for everybody that kind of worked through this deep Pluto energy. This is a subject matter that's not light. It's really hopefully getting into you somewhere. It might be worthwhile coming back to this recording at different times and re-approaching, because I'm hoping that this is kind of more of a transmission, even though you might be receiving this at different times and different places, not just right now, so that you can start to interact with life on a much different level, on a collective level, the level of the matrix, to kind of see how you are just an actor in something that's happening, and that there's a story at the root of your soul that you're trying to grow and learn through. And that once you realize that, it kind of gives you a different experience with life, so that when you have these experiences that trigger you, kind of these stories that keep coming up, you kind of see it for what it is, and it doesn't take you down as much. Then you're like, oh, okay, we're learning this. So having said that, yes, thank you, Marianne. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for sharing your stories, listening to my stories. And I know a lot of you continue to participate in these webinars, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful. So again, my name is Katie Sweetman. This has been Pluto turning shadows into light. Sorry, it's been a long webinar. And I wish you all a wonderful eclipse, and I wish you all a new relationship with the Pluto in your chart. So, bye.